All right, here we go. Good to see you, Ekta. So today we're really just going over a broad sweep of really China's relations in South Asia, because there's been a number of smaller developments on this within the last couple of months that we don't always get to talk about quite as much. So I thought it'd be a good idea to just hop around the area and touch on some of these issues. And I know you've been writing on some of them as well. So the first one I wanted to start with is there anything to say of recent for China-India border developments and the trajectory of how this is going? Are we still at sort of a stall? I know they had some recent talks.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Hello. Glad to talk to you today. Yes, the most recent, I would say, conflict that made major headlines was not very far off. It was in December. So in December, you had a border clash between India and China on a very new front. It was on the eastern border, which they had never seen a clash on, which raised quite a few alarms in India. We saw India extending their troops in that part of the border, and otherwise also generally on the border, I would say there are still tensions, and tensions because we've seen infrastructure build up since 2020. On the China side, I would say even before 2020, it was in 2017 that the first Doklam clash that happened near the Bhutan border. That was, I think, when after which we saw a huge development in infrastructure, and especially military infrastructure on the Chinese side of the border. And it has only continued. We see the development of air bases, we see the upgradation of air bases, not only development, more fighters near the Indian borders, more drone facilities, and just logistical support for the Chinese Air Force. Of course, India has a little bit of advantage, as most analysts point out, because it can fly its planes through plain areas to the conflict zone, but China has to fly through a very high altitude in the Tibet region. But that is very fast changing. I mean, you we have seen a great escalatory just projection from China. Of course, there has been same kind of retaliation, if you would say, from India. Both the countries. What was notable during these last few weeks was we saw one of the first meetings of a on a diplomatic level between China and India, especially on the border issues. We hadn't seen anything like that, I think, since 2019 or 2020, if I'm not wrong. So almost 3 years, these countries, the diplomatic relations at least have worsened. The leaders don't meet, they don't talk to each other. We haven't seen those type of interactions to keep the tensions down. So tensions, I think, because of the border diplomatically are still high, but there is a little incentive in this point at this time, I think, because of the current one, that is the we have the opening in the Chinese economy. So we know China and India have very India is definitely very dependent on Chinese raw materials, and economic ties have not been as effective as the diplomatic ties. We always talk about that. And second, we have the G20 and whole of the diplomacy going around in G20 in India. We had the Chinese foreign minister visit India for the foreign ministers G20 meet. Maybe we could have a possibility of Chinese Premier Xi Jinping visiting India for the summit in September, and you could see a round of meetings on the border issues, some disengagement from few border points and things like that. So you could see those breakthroughs, but I think that would still be very temporary, because we have this permanent projection of power, permanent projection of aggression from the Chinese side. And yeah, at least from the diplomatic statements, India wants status quo as it was before May 2020, which I think is very difficult because China has hardened its stances on the border. So yeah, it's a very tenuous relationship, and I think it will be in this tensed piece that will continue. We will have a high risk of these border flares here and there, because patrolling teams tend to just face each other, and there are conflicts just there's spontaneous like that. But we that tension would remain high, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to dig a little bit more into that sort of broader economic. I don't want to call it competition going on between China and India at this point because that would be a little exaggerated. But there has been some tensions lately, right? And from China's perspective, Beijing very much wants to keep India from going into the U.S. orbit, right? Getting more involved in things like the Quad and in what China sees as a U.S.-led containment effort to stop China's growth, its military development, all of this. As you've pointed out in a number of formats for us, that's not really India's goal. They don't wish to join a U.S.-led containment effort, but India does have its own economic and security concerns about China. I wonder if you could briefly step us through what has been driving some of the more recent, if limited, Indian economic small steps away from China, perhaps tech investment restrictions or something of the like.
So it, as I said, I mean, this decoupling that India, like the US, everybody, especially after COVID and just depending on the Chinese supply chains, there is this whole I won't say the movement, but every country is exploring new supply lines, and they want to diversify those supply lines. Even for India, after the border conflict happened, just thinking about the economic relations, India is very much dependent on Russia. It has the highest level of trade deficits every year with China and things like that. And it's dependent on very important industries like specialty elements. It could be pharmaceutical industry, very important, fertilizers, telecommunication equipment. India is very dependent on China, I would say that. And this decoupling, that, of course, because you have a active standoff at the border, but there's this conflict going on the border, you need some kind of decoupling from China, but I do not think that's going to happen anytime soon. Yes, India has restricted a number of apps where when the conflict happened, but what I see currently is there is more scrutiny on Chinese investment that's coming in India. Not to say that Chinese FDI investment has stopped. I mean, there are still proposals. The ministry still passes them. It's just that they're very aware about how the money is coming into China and what Chinese, especially Chinese companies are doing in India, how they use the data and what goes in and out. I think that has increased a lot. But other than that, the decoupling with from China will take a long time. We just today we saw, we talked about a memorandum of understanding between US and India about the semiconductor industry, and so that's those relationships I think will continue. We will see more India trying to take advantage of this moment in time when China is just opening up, but trying to attract investments in its own sectors, when China is not a very viable alternative for the world.
Yeah, so it would seem that India is in the same pool as Europe and as East Asia in that there is some limited decoupling happening with China, but it's part of this broader global moment where many countries are examining their supply chains and seeing, well, maybe it's not the best thing if we rely, 80% on country fill in the blank. Many times it's China, but regardless, for whatever. So this is part of the broader moment and not necessarily indicative that India is going the US route, which is a little bit more of an aggressive route. Although, to your point, even the US, we wouldn't call that extreme decoupling, but it certainly is faster than its partners.
Yeah, it's also difficult for India because you have, I mean, they share a huge land border. You cannot have a active uh, deteriorating relationship with China. You have to balance that. Just thinking about long term, thinking about stability. These are two major powers in the region, and they have to learn to live besides each other.
Right, that's the reality that China has when you share borders with, what is it, 14 countries? And the same thing with India. You can't afford to have long-standing spats for too long. You need to learn to deal with these issues. Okay, well, I think we're coming up on time. Thanks so much, Ekta, especially for carrying the conversation today. But if listeners want to, they can learn more about our products, about South Asia, China, and the whole rest of the world at ranenetwork.com. Thanks so much, Ekta.
Thank you.